You have headphones there if you need them, but you don't really do headphones, do you? Do you not like the sound of your own voice or something?
I'm good.
I'm good.
I'm good.
I'm good. That's the most British response to anything that you don't want to do. I'm good. I'm good, mate.
Good. I'm all right. I'm all right.
I'm all right, mate.
I'm all right.
I'm all right. Don't worry about it.
I'm all right.
I'm all right. People now who are fans of yours will be reading things and coming to terms with the subject matter to some degree on this album. Mm-hmm. And it will establish an expectation in some way, shape, or form, which probably was the point partly, but also I kind of want to say something personally, if that's all right.
Please.
This is a beautiful and thoroughly enjoyable, wonderful album.
Thanks, man.
And I just don't want people to think like I need to be in a certain mood to listen to this record. I need to prepare myself in some way, because I think that you've done all the preparation, and what we get is the process done and the thoughts complete. And it's beautiful, man.
Thank you, mate. I appreciate that. And I think it was important to start at the beginning of the story of making this record for me. So the first song I wrote was a song called Cannibal, and that felt like the first song that had to go on the track listing, first song to come out as well.
Very brave,
but then
very
it was
courageous.
Followed closely by Grace, which is, the answer to it in my view. And songwriting wise, it was the second song I wrote for the record. So pretty much going in chronological order. But what people hadn't heard yet is where it gets to, which really it's a record about freedom, and it's a record about healing. But I think, certainly in my story, it's important to face up to some of the gnarlier stuff first in order to get to that place of freedom and healing. And in the way we've rolled out this record, it starts with some of the harder stuff. So if people can get through that, it's worth the wait, I think, because we do get to a place where it is fun.
What do we want from our art and from our artists, if not the truth, be it brutal or otherwise? And I feel like many artists have gone before you who have faced up to something difficult and challenging to acknowledge through their art. Very few of them choose to actually do it in a chronological order way. And so my question is why, when it could have been an important moment on the album, song 4, it would still have been a talking point and something you could have aired out and processed in real time, but why do it that way?
Because it just felt right. It felt like I would be continuing falling into the temptation of denial and sort of hiding a little bit, which has been part of the problem for me historically in my life. Whereas I feel like I don't have anything to hide. And so the story of the record started with that song. And so it was important to me for it to feel like it had integrity in the way it rolled out and the track listing. And it'll put some people off, but I'm cool.
No, not the real ones. But the thing that really struck me that was the saddest thing. I'm not going to create a hierarchy of emotions and sadness. One of the saddest...
What's the saddest thing on the show?
Really? That was the saddest thing? The kick drum's slightly loud. That was the saddest thing.
Yeah, right.
No, one of the things that struck me the most about that song and about that particular experience was that it wasn't something that had been unlocked through work and all of a sudden you had to acknowledge and embrace it after the fact. It sounds to me like it had been with you your whole life. Mm-hmm. You just never talked about it. Mm-hmm. And that is a whole other experience. A lot of people are suffering from significant trauma, which is buried somewhere deep, and it requires a lot of work, hypnotherapy and whatever to unlock it, right? Mm-hmm. You just sat with it and let it be in you for your whole life up to that point.
I mean, what I'm learning now is that it's super common to suppress things really hard to the extent where you don't think they're a problem at all until someone says like, let's look at that a bit deeper.
Yeah.
And so that's the point I came to in my life where people around me was like, you got some stuff to look at here. Things aren't quite right. And then the opportunity presented itself and I took it. What I don't love, for me at least, is the idea of bravery around that, because it implies that people who don't talk about their trauma
are not.
And I don't think it's about that. I think it's taking the opportunities when you get them, and sometimes those opportunities just aren't presented for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so I think, I would sort of encourage people to look at things when they can and when the opportunities arise, but not judge people for not, because I certainly went through a long period of my life where I didn't look at any of that stuff.
I agree. And in my own experience, it's taken me time to acknowledge and move through things. And I never looked back on myself before that as being someone who was weak. So I understand that. I wanted to ask you though, if at all, in what ways do you feel now that you were even subconsciously doing this to help others? Did it ever cross your mind that your story was going to be helpful to other people?
No, it didn't. And it's not a charitable record in that sense. It's an extension of me as an artist. So I'm writing about things that are going on in my life from an incredibly narcissistic point of view, which is the job of the artist.
That's
right?
the job.
Well, like I so admire artists who can take on other people's stories and write them. But I'm not great at that. Like Bob Dylan is great at that. Bono is good at that. Johnny Flynn is the best at that in my view. But I'm not very good at that. So I've got to write about my stuff. And so what I wanted to do on this, I started in January with this task ahead of me, and I didn't know at that point whether it was going to be for the band or for someone else or for me. I just said, I need to reconnect with my songwriting muscles. They've gone into atrophy during COVID. I did a bit of scoring work, and I did a bit of songwriting, but not enough that the songwriting muscles weren't being exercised. So I just went away and said to the lads in the band, look, I'm going to go away and write. I don't know what it's for, but I'm just going to follow the creative, and I'm going to set myself the task of writing as honestly as I can.
Can I ask where away was before we continue this thought?
Yeah, it was at home in Devon, in England, in my little studio to start with. And then because I have a US passport, as long as I did the quarantining the right way, I was able to come to LA. So once I'd started writing, I connected with Blake Mills, who I'd written a song with 6 years previously, and we'd toured together, and I've been a huge fan of his work for a long time, both his writing and his playing and his production. And I took him Cannibal in its infancy as a song and said, do you want to work on this with me? I don't know what it's for. At the moment, it's not for any particular record. I just want to kind of flesh it out. And we did that, came together quite quick, and then we moved straight on to Grace. And that was the second song. Better Off High was the third. So we just kept rolling. And even up until like November 21, I was refusing to refer to it as a record. It was still a collection of songs.
I understand why that is because, and you have your own reasons, but the way I look at things is when it becomes a record, it becomes something that's on not only on the record, that's the obvious observation, but it's also something that puts a framework around it, which can actually make you start to overthink things.
Yeah, and you start thinking about release and how people will listen to it. So for my process, I just was vehemently opposed to the idea of labeling it until it felt like a thing.
Can I ask, when you were at home in Devon and you'd written Cannibal, which obviously was one of those things that came out, and I don't know if it caught you off guard or how present you were when you were actually writing it.
I don't really remember writing it.
Right, there you go. But you're still sharing a house with Carrie and with your kids, and you're in a family environment at a time when it is an enforced family environment. That is a beautiful thing, except when you're in a space with something like that is coming out. And how you carried yourself in that moment, being a loving husband and a loving father, but knowing that your life had fundamentally changed. The direction that you were on had fundamentally changed.
Well, yeah, 6 months earlier, I'd told someone I was sexually abused as a kid, which I hadn't told anyone for what would have been 25 years at least. And so when it came to sit down to write, that was kind of the obvious thing to write about, weirdly, for me. And at that point, I had no intention of ever putting it out or anything like that. I have a safe space, a studio space in Devon, which I'm blessed with, which I could go in, shut the curtains, and theoretically no one would bother me. What I didn't quite realize at the time was that it shares a wall with the room that my parents moved into during COVID. So my mum could hear music through the wall. And so she likes 1, 4, and 5 chords with the odd 6 minor. She doesn't love a 3 major. I know the chords she likes.
Yeah, of course.
She loves 4 on the floor.
Yeah.
Absolutely loves it. So Cannibal, in theory, if you can't hear the lyrics, is a perfect song for her.
Oh, yeah.
It's mostly 1, 4,
She's
and 5.
like, Marcus is in a great mood. He is writing a club
bit
banger.
of 4 on the floor.
This
She's
new
like,
Mumford & Sons album is going to be banger.
That sounds lovely.
After banger after banger. Mate, she's getting ready to drop one.
Yeah. I cut out my headphones on, but I know you did something goofy. So she hears it through the wall, and that's the only real interruption I have in the process of writing that song. And it was after I finished it, and I've been in this place now for 6 months of kind of working on recovery stuff or healing stuff, and was owning my story. So
Yeah.
in you come and hear it. That's fine.
But were you ever concerned about when that day might arrive, or you knew at some point you were going to have to cross that bridge with your mum?
Well, no, what was weird is that I thought my mum knew about the abuse thing.
Yeah, that's the thing that really struck me when in the one piece I read, which was a great piece in GQ, respect to the writer and to you for going into such a safe space right out the gate. Very compelling and very interesting. Was the way that it was worded, at least, and you've just confirmed that, was that you just sort of like, oh, yeah, it's about the thing.
I thought she knew about it. Because so she listens to Cannibal. She says, like, a few days later, she can ask what that song's about. I was like, of course you can. Yeah, it's about that.
What a parental moment.
And she was like, what are you talking about? And I was convinced that I'd told her. Only 6 months later, I was convinced I told her, and I hadn't. Power of the brain's wild.
Wow.
So bless her. You know, once she gets through the difficulty of that moment as a mother, it's objectively hilarious to tell your mother you were sexually abused in a song. Like, that's a punchline. You know, that's just funny. So bless her. Once she got through it, we did laugh about it.
Well, humor is a very, very powerful therapy.
And then I wrote Grace about, you know, starting with like, how should we proceed without it getting too heavy?
Which,
you know,
has hints of that humor you talk about it in it, which was like, we are just now going to get through this.
Here we go.
And we're going to find our way to do it. And I know what you mean. I mean, it's funny that it's funny, but it's not something that is like, oh, I went to the comedy store and that was the subject and la ha ha. It's kind of almost like a humor it's a muscle you need in order to process things. It's as important as tears.
Yeah, I agree. And it helps put things in perspective a bit. And it helps process, you know, because there can be things about it that are really fun. And that, to me, is just objectively quite funny.
And what a great process to be able to, again, strengthen the bond within family, to be able to face it through and get through it. 1, 2, and straight into the rest of the record as we move forward, we start to hear hints of what I felt the new Mumford & Sons album could have been. You know, it's definitely your journey and your album. It's a self-titled record and it's start to finish great. But it's funny hearing some of the sonic contributions being made and the way I could actually hear a 3-piece moving and a different Mumford & Sons. Has this album been good for you in terms of helping recalibrate post the departure of Win?
Yeah, it has. And I'm pretty stoked to take some of the stuff I've learned back to the band now, which I will do after this record. Because for me, it kind of blew the doors off this weird structure we have around the band that in any kind of institution after 15 years, it will freshen it up. And that creatively, to me, I think going through the motions is the death of creativity. So, and I don't think we have been, but we might have. And I'm pretty excited now to go back with this possibility of sound that I've learned more from, you know, working with Blake Mills, with Soundwave, with these amazing collaborators on this record, and more collaborators than I might have on a Mumford & Sons record, where we normally keep the writing very much in-house. On this record, I was like, I'll write with whoever's around and down to write. You know, whether it's Tobias, Gesso, Jr. I want to learn from these people. Yeah. And a lot of them were LA-based because I was here. You know, Julia Michaels. I spent an afternoon with Julia.
Oh, she's the
best.
best.
And she completely changed the way I view writing lyrics.
She's the best.
Crazy. We did Prior Warning, which is the third song on the record. And we're sitting there together and we'd done like 5 hours. And this is a point where I didn't know I was making a solo record, really. I was just kind of trying out writing with people. And I've always been collaborative, but it's always been in the band.
Yeah.
So fairly exclusive. And this time I was like, well, I was excited to work with women for a start because I've been in a sausage fest. And so we're like 5.5 hours in, we're getting to the point where like, do you know what? Sometimes these things just don't work out and that's fine. It's really nice to meet you.
At her best.
And then she's like, let's just try one more thing. We sit in the live room. She's like, what instrument do you feel most comfortable on? And bizarrely, I said the piano. I must have been nervous because I said the piano. I don't play piano. But there I am, sat at the piano. I can play the white notes, not the back ones. So I'm playing in C. And then she's like, what do you want to write about? So I'd written it down on a piece. I write everything by hand. So I got these lyric books for this record, which are chock full. And I wrote it all out by hand, the story I wanted to tell. And she's like, okay, just sing that. And I went, well, I can't because it doesn't rhyme. And she goes, that, just sing it. And sort of held my hand through singing what became almost word for word Prior Warning. So it was just what was on the page.
putting on my running gear, I knew that this was coming is the most sort of beautiful example of the magic that Julia Michaels can bring in. She takes something that seems so everyday in people's lives and turns that into the soul of a song. People call it conversation or whatever you want to be. It's just a beautiful, fantastical version of reality. Whereas most songwriting is sort of almost the reverse. It's like reality turned into fantasy. She's like, I take it the other way. I find the fantasy in reality.
And that was really, Blake really responded to the writing of that because it was quite specific and there wasn't much poetic license. In fact, there's not that much poetic license going on this record, which has been a lesson for me as well. I'm always like, well, we got to turn that thought or that scene or that idea into something a bit more flowery, a bit more formal because we're writing a song. And actually with songs like Only Child and Prior Warning on this record, that's just not the case. The specificity can really help, I think, with the setting of the scene.
Well, this particular song really needed it because you were talking about a subject that, if not dealt with direct, could have easily fallen into that group of grey. And grey's great for the art. It's great for me as a fan, great for you as an artist. It gives me something to work with and you something to work with.
Yeah, we were uncompromising with grey on this record.
You really were. Black or white, 100%.
And we would, Blake and I would sit there, having gathered little bits of writing here and there, and a lot of the time we were kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. And we would put these songs on the sort of surgical table and say, are these as honest as they could be? And it was like we were dissecting something in a science class together. And we treated the songs really objectively and tried to remove emotion from it and say, like, who cares who wrote it? Is this honest? And does this line up with the spirit of the record? We're going to be relentlessly honest in the way we write these songs.
What you were actually doing instinctively was being the most emotionally raw you could be. Now, you can't carry that into a diligent environment to finish it. Otherwise, you'll just basically cry and turn around and never put it out. I mean, this verse, each word is a cut that I see coming. The shame and guilt becomes overwhelming and I gotta share it. But it's going to hurt someone I love because I need their forgiveness. So I clench my fists as I'm inflicting them because I realize that I'm bullying someone. I'm basically mugging somebody to feel better. And now I'm running out of parts that I can play, which is where I then create an identity around this behavior in order to try to justify it. Because I can't be a hero anymore because this isn't how a hero acts. I'm not the dodger because I'm facing it down and I'm not being that.
And I played the Artful Dodger at school, but yeah.
Well, okay, more specific, appreciate it. And I'm not the preacher's son, so I can't lean into my faith as a reason. It's the most honest example of one of humanity's greatest flaws, which is we hurt the ones we love in order to seek salvation.
You got it, man.
It's fucking crushing.
You got it. That was the whole point of it.
No matter how many times you do it, you ask yourself, why? Why do I need to do this to the person I love the most? And that's why that song moved me so much the first time I heard it. It's because it's rare that gets faced down. That idea of, I'm not mentally wired right, and then now it's your fault. Or it's your responsibility.
Yeah, and the process of recognizing that is such an important part to unpicking the things that get in the way of healing, you know?
Well, it's a great foundation for love because what it shows is that it can withstand anything and you can come through the other side if you're willing to do the work and prove that you actually care enough to acknowledge it.
Yeah, I believe that. But it can be painful.
Dude, for real, that's why it matters.
So, yeah, and then getting sonically, having something in that song, Prior Warning, that felt slightly more dangerous, slightly more like a dirge, but then Soundwave came in. I remember the moment he put in that drum fill that happens halfway through. I was like, this is what we want. This is what we need.
Soundwave's feel through the whole album is great, and those little modern touches, which isn't to say that Blake is in a retroactive space. He's a total sound beast, but Soundwave just brings in these things that just all of a sudden you're transported into a slightly wavier version of what you're experiencing.
And again, that was just the part of the expression of freedom on this record. Like, yeah, if Soundwave's down, let's go into the studio together and see what happens. I mean, I was looking through the offcuts from this record, of which there are a lot, because we crafted it so with such attention. There's a lot we didn't use, and some of the Soundwave offcuts are dope. I'm like, I really want to do something like that. I actually texted him yesterday. I was like, let's I'm here. Let's
keep
do another
going.
couple of days. Yeah, he's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I bet.
And one of my favorite producers ever, let alone right now. So
There's some amazing people who join you on this record, and some amazing people that joined you on the journey but didn't actually end up on the record. And again, it just comes down to you and Blake, right? Ultimately making those calls and saying it's not about personally owing anybody for their time. It's about what's going to serve this album in a really beautiful way.
yeah,
To do that, you got to have a through line. So taking away the subject matter and the chronological aspects of the writing of this record, how did you come to the agreement that Phineas isn't going to, that's not going to work here versus that?
I think it was what songs. I knew it couldn't be more than 10 songs.
You gave yourself that architecture.
Yeah, I felt like, okay, if you're going to make a record in this day and age, I think it's worth trying to make it as slimline as possible. Because I do want people to hear the whole thing, but you're demanding a lot of people's attention. I think we've made that mistake. I've made that mistake in the past where I've let things get too swollen and delivered something to the audience that is quite hard to digest. I mean, it'll take years, to digest some of this stuff. Like Delta with the band was 14 songs. So, and Elton John, who was a real inspiration from the beginning of this process, sat me down early on and was like, you are not allowed to make it more than 10 songs.
What was his reasoning for it? For that same reasons?
Yeah, same reasons, I think. And it brings this intentionality, like, okay, then every song has really got to fight for its place. We're not going to let any in the door just because we kind of like them or they're sweet to have around. Or
I love that day with that person.
Yeah. Every song has to fight for its place. And so that meant that we edited hard. Really hard.
Yeah, you did. Who else didn't make it? I mean,
there's a 6 song with Cass McCombs that we wrote.
I love Cass McCombs.
Yeah, which was amazing. There's a wonderful song that I would love to resurrect one day with Ezra Koenig from Vampire Weekend.
Yeah.
And I think those songs, luckily, I remember them and I have little voice note recordings of them and I'm sure they'll live another life. But for this record, Blake and I think knew in our bones what it needed and what it didn't.
How will you sum up this part of your life, do you think, in the years to come, when you look back on the last year and a half, 2 years from Cannibal to today and the shows that you'll do and whatnot? How do you think you put a ribbon on it? What will be the overarching filter you'll see this life through?
I feel free in more ways than one for the first time in my life, which is cool. I mean, creatively, I feel really free now. I feel like I can do whatever I want to do, which is premium.
But the freedom as well of knowing that you can move through life and face it all down and you don't have to clench your fists anymore.
Yeah, I feel better equipped for that stuff, for sure, which really helps with creativity.
But were there times when it was hard not to care what people thought about when Mumfords were at the peak of success in the 1.0? We were now in a 2.0.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of it, I don't remember that well.
Is that because of the alcohol or the adrenaline or all the above?
Both, I think. And being young and it being a whirlwind and a constant party. And I don't have any regrets around that. But I feel more present and connected now because I think of the work that I've done and having a bit more patience with stuff and feeling less like I've got to win every room I walk into. So it's not a competitive edge thing. That was more like a people-pleasing thing.
People-pleasing is so funny, right? And again, we're very similar in that regard. And it took someone to tell me, my therapist to tell me, in trying to please everybody, you're actually sort of mugging them. You're sort of just taking their goodwill and sort of translating it and using it to feed yourself in an area that's totally vacuous.
And I found kids reflect this stuff. Like, I'm having long conversations with my daughter about taste.
Right.
Because there's some things she just doesn't like. We played with Joni Mitchell at Newport. I'm sure I shouldn't tell this story.
It's really hard to fall in love with Joni out the gate. And Brandi will tell you that.
We were like playing it to her in the car. She goes, I really respect. She's 6. I really,
the R card.
I really respect her for what she's done for women in music.
Oh Lord!
But it doesn't mean I have to like it.
Yeah, I mean, what a flawless answer.
So we're having conversations, and those taste conversations are so helpful. Like, not everyone has to like everything, you know, and that I think comes as a result of doing more work on codependent stuff. Like,
Yeah.
it's cool if I like something and my wife doesn't. That's cool. That's fine.
Well, you know, that was at the core of the band. I felt like you're all quite individual people. I know you're all pretty well. I know you and Ben best, but you're all individuals. And ultimately that led to the departure of Win. I don't really want to talk about this when you come back as a band. I'd rather do it now for 2 minutes because it'll just be really old news by then and everyone's gone on with their lives. We haven't spoken about it. And what's the thing that you think when you go back in the band and it's 3 of you in a room is going to be glaringly omitted?
Win, I think, inspired a lot of the songwriting as well as the sound. Like, when the banjo was so important for the first 2 Mumford & Sons records. The lead guitar was so important for the third. So I think we'll miss that for sure. But I think most bands stayed together in their original lineups for too long.
Chris Martin said the same thing to me in a different way.
Yeah.
He said bands aren't really supposed to last forever.
Yeah, and there are anomalies like U2
And Coldplay.
and
Who learned from you two.
but even the Stones, you know, bands change, lineups change, and I think that's fine. I think when you're stuck in a creative partnership that not everyone feels aligned in and wants to be in, then surely you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And avoiding that feels like the thing to do if you want to have integrity in your creativity. So I'm kind of stoked about the next phase for the band because it presents itself as a creative opportunity. Like, the things we might miss from Winston not being in the band are things we can find elsewhere
Or
in
within each
exciting
other.
ways.
Or within each other. Here
Yeah.
comes Ted, who knew he was Phil Collins.
Well, Ted's the best guitarist in the band by a long way.
Well, there you go.
I see it as a creative opportunity, honestly, and that's not just like a PR spin. I really do. I feel, and making this record has made me appreciate that even more.
I love that. And by the way, Delta, oh man, I'm not going to lie to you. It felt like the end of whatever it was.
Yeah.
It just did at the time.
Yeah.
And I actually thought...
It was a punctuation mark.
I've never said this to you before. I don't mind telling you this now. I actually got on the plane from New Orleans after we'd had that really nice night with your baseball buddy, which was epic. Yeah. And I actually thought, I don't know if there's going to be another Mumford & Sons record. I just had this feeling like the guys might call time on this now.
It was good end to the first chapter, and I have no idea what the next chapter is going to look like. But I know I'm going back into it in a better place than I was when we started or when we did the 4th record. So who knows?
You look amazing, by the way. It should
Thanks,
be
man.
acknowledged. I mean, we try not to put things on the surface too hard, but when you're on a quarantine comeback like you are, holy shit.
It was part of the whole deal for me, taking responsibility for stuff. My doctor told me if I wanted to see my kids grow up, I was pre-diabetic. He was like, you got to sort some stuff out.
What'd you have
it
to
was
sort out?
Medical reasons for me.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was clinically obese, which was damaging my health and shortening my lifespan, or the idea of it. So it was time to, and I think I'd always sort of felt like at school and I was the fat kid, and that was kind of just who I was and what I was going to be. And my doctor was like, well, no, you have more control over that than you think you do. It's just going to take some work.
And so what did you do? How'd you change your life?
I quit booze and replaced it with ice cream. Turns out
Equally
net
bad.
zero.
Yeah, exactly. although I have to say, I've known people and myself have quit things and replaced them with things way less fun. The idea of replacing anything that's clinically addictive with ice cream is worth it for a phase.
Yeah, and to be honest, at that point, it was about getting the hooks of booze out of me, so that was helpful.
Can I just hyper focus on the granular here for a second and just ask you what ice cream? What was it? The Hard D?
Ben and Jerry's.
Oh, that's brutal. What flavor though?
But the thing is, I live in Devon, which is really the ice cream capital of the world.
Oh, you kept it local.
So there's some local stuff in Devon that blow your mind. These Americans have no idea about clotted cream ice cream from
which
Devon.
is fucking fantastic.
From South Devon cows.
They also, out here, they don't have, which I only realized after I moved here, that may have affected my decision. They don't stock the famous Haagen-Dazs strawberry cheesecake ice cream. It seems Waitrose just have this like unlimited fucking Wonka factory full of.
Pralines and cream was my go-to drug of choice. But of course, I know, this is just my story, right? I'm not into the body shaming thing because I think, there's too much judgment around with that stuff. For me, it was just a straight up health thing and getting to a place where I could then enjoy ice cream when I wanted to, but wasn't needing it every day.
Can you enjoy alcohol when you want to?
I think I'll get to the place where I don't do AA and stuff. I stopped before that became a necessity. Much as I respect and love that world, and I've seen the effect it has on so many of my friends, and it's completely dope.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me that wasn't necessary. I sort of think of addictions like faders on your mixing desk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can pick anything you want to self-medicate some sort of pain in your brain, and it can be Xbox, or it can be the radio, or it can be surfing, or it could be heroin, or it could be ice cream. And if any of the faders is too high in the mix, it peaks the whole mix out. And that's basically what you can hear. If you have the snare drum turned all the way up and everything else is at zero, you're just going to hear snare drum in the mix. So you got to bring that down somehow. So for me, I just needed to address the faders on my mixing desk.
I love that analogy.
So the Greeks were right when they talked about nothing to excess, right? And know thyself. Those are the two inscriptions at the Temple of Delphi. And those things feel still true to me. But so it's just getting a balance and a control back around stuff, because I've got an addictive personality, and feeling like I could choose when to engage with certain things. So booze I may engage with again, but I don't really feel the need to. I really am enjoying myself.
What about when you're out socially and stuff like that, and the role that alcohol played for you? How are you going to replace that?
It was just a buffer,
right?
Social buffer, and now I just leave.
LA
it's
exit.
Wicked.
LA exit.
It's so dope.
I'm really good at it.
Say hello to everyone. Say goodbye to no one.
I'm so good at it.
But yeah, just feeling, and that's part of the whole deal, like feeling less like more focused on what you think you need and less focused on what other people think about you.
I love it, man. It's growth. It's a beautiful
freeing,
thing. What about the relationships that you've developed over the course of this kind of young adult part of your life, which is wrapped up in success and expectation? And this is one of the things that people have to acknowledge about Marcus, if you don't mind me saying, for camera and for audio, is that he's one of the most wonderful, likable human beings you'll ever meet at the first time. And I don't mean that in he's an overly charming.
And then
no wait, it gets good, because it's not an overly charming thing. That can be too much for people like me, but it's just, you're very straight up, and you just find ways to introduce interesting people to one another. And it's, I suppose for lack of a better term, it's what people call connector. You're very good at that. Yeah. You're very good at it.
It's fun.
But that being said, like you're embarking on a different era of your life. In the last 2 years, you get to know yourself. No one had a chance to do that. And now you're about to go out and play shows and live that life and be Marcus in the room again. And do you feel any kind of social anxiety at the thought of that, or are you excited about it just from a different perspective?
The thing I feel a little anxious about right now, and I'm planning for a bit, is the routine that I got to connect with because of COVID in a way I hadn't since high school. I didn't have a sense of home around place since school, since I was 18, because I was out the door and then on the road, and was never in one place longer than a couple months.
Do you think you were running in a way? Not to sidetrack you, but
maybe
a little bit.
I was working mostly.
Right. Yeah, right.
And so COVID provided the opportunity for sort of stability for me that was helpful with all this stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Healing work and taking responsibility of my body and stuff like that. And I'm a little nervous about losing that, because I'm about to head out on a 14-week-long tour before pretty much before Christmas. It's straight. I said to my agent, I'm going to tour this solo record once, so let's just go hard and let's go deep. And he presented me with a 9-week theatre tour of the United States of America and Toronto. Canadians are a bit pissed off, I think. And
because you're only going to Toronto.
That's quite literal. We are going hard. So I'm excited to play it. And then I'm going to the UK, and it's gonna be good. But I'm a little bit nervous about losing the stability that I've had. And being in LA, waking up and surfing before work.
That's a good day.
It's pretty cool.
I wanted to ask you about that because, you're someone who is synonymous with this era of songwriting and success that came out of the United Kingdom. Looking back on that now, what an incredible time.
Oh, man, yeah.
Florence, you, Laura, right through to people like Jack, Jamie T, of course, Adele. Just an amazing group.
She's really coming along.
Adele, she'll get there in the end. She'll get there in the end. Well, look, we all knew it was going to take time.
She's getting there. Yeah.
So you were
it was a wild period of time.
It was a wild period of time, but everybody in a way wore the flag, waved the flag, not in an overly patriotic way, but it's like, this is who we are and where we come from, and this is Camden, baby. And then you're able to pick and choose where you go. You spent quarantine at home, and now you've chosen to move back to the West Coast of America. What kind of promoted and prompted that idea in your head of wanting to kind of move to a different climate? It's very different to London, having lived in both.
It's about having a base while we're touring, and I don't think we'd sort of claimed necessarily to have moved here properly, but we've got to have a base, and that base is easier because this country is so massive. It means you have to tour it for a long time, and I think I was born here, so I don't. I
forgot
I don't
about
feel
that.
that same sense of like I'm selling out to LA. There's a sense in which this has always felt like a version of home to me as well. So
I love that the UK still has this grip on all of us, including myself, that if we ever turn our back on it, you're fucking changed.
Yeah, exactly.
You couldn't handle it, huh? Couldn't handle the hard stuff.
Yeah, and I remember when Kid Harpoon left Holloway, everyone was like, oh wow, London is dead. If all these guys are now moving to LA, if he's gone, then the last sort of bastion of London has gone.
And things have changed so dramatically as well in the last few years, in particular in these two kind of like tent poles of the West. You've always been someone who's written not only about what's going on inside of you, in particular on this record, but also you're unafraid to look out the window. Do you get inspired by that artistically at the moment, or are you letting it marinate, or are you letting it sit? Because I know you don't like to project your own opinions on people, but I love the way that you do it in your own way.
I don't know. I don't have some huge philosophical bomb to drop on you right now. But it does feel to me like we're coming out of a period of time where we weren't as able to connect with each other and share space in the way I think we're designed to gather in communities. And so I'm excited at the prospect of doing more of that again. And I think we need it for health. And I've been living in the sticks for the last couple of years, but still very much in community. And this idea of placebo community, I just don't think works. And I think we're going to wake up to that soon. And we need real people to engage with and neighbors to engage with.
I love that philosophy and I love the outlook. I was talking to Aaron Dessner this morning and he used a great term, which was, he said sometimes, I can definitely skew apocalyptic. and I thought that not only fit together beautifully as two words, but was actually a good way to describe.
Well, and Delta, a lot of that Delta song is about, being afraid of people that you can't know. And
like
engage
intrinsically know, like we're just separate.
Yeah, and I think most of the time when you meet someone in the flesh, it kind of humanizes them, of course, in a way that makes them, and I'm talking really generally, less fear-inducing than they might be from
in the placebo community,
the way you've seen them appear in the world, which is why I think how you appear in the world is important. And I do think there's value in thinking that through carefully, and more important in a way than ever, because we judge each other quite quickly on how we appear in the world. So I do think you've got to be intentional about that. But I like the idea that we have a bit more grace for each other, like, that person's not great, or they haven't spent as much time thinking about how they appear in the world. So I'll give them a crack in the flesh. And then if they're a real they can f
off. They can
like the idea that you get grace for a second shot.
It's really interesting to me because as a band who exists, and therefore an artist who exists on the idea of bringing community together, the gathering has always been an important part of what's motivated a Mumford and Sons experience. I wonder if there's been moments when you've wondered, like, let me rephrase this, like, is there anyone that you feel you can't reach, or at least go into trying to reach, even if philosophically?
Well, I think I'm an optimist, right? So I wouldn't verge towards the apocalyptic tilt of a Dessner, because I believe that there's...
He said skew.
Yeah, right, skew. I believe that there's good in everyone. So, and it's been really interesting looking a bit more closely at this trauma stuff, particularly, and developing a relationship with this guy, Brian Stevenson, who is a long story, but he's a public defender, works out of Montgomery, Alabama, wrote this book called Just Mercy that I read and became completely obsessed with his mind. We became friends in a very unlikely way. And the way he looks after people on death row and lifers without parole and insists that we're better than the worst thing we've ever done. And so therefore being defined by, and more importantly, condemned for the worst thing we've ever done is not the gracious way in which humanity was built to live, and what it says about us when we condemn someone for the worst thing they've ever done, or I would add, had done to them, that we're not living our best selves. So I think the idea of grace to me is a really important one, because most of the time behind someone who presents as heinous in some way, there is a story there in their life that doesn't ever excuse, but sometimes helps explain and humanize where they've got to and the choices they've made. And I think that's true for addicts. I think it's true for people who are condemned of, criminal stuff. I think it's probably true for some of the public figures that we love to hate.
I think this is a really good way for us to kind of call time on this, which has flown by. But you really exercise that in process on the last song on the album. It's almost like you're extending a hand to the individual or the circumstances, as if to say, I can't do this unless there's some form of investment on both sides. I cannot do this on my own. I need there to be some closure here on all sides. And it's an incredibly powerful moment. Simple question. I know where you were when you wrote Cannibal. This is the last song on the record. Where were you when you wrote this? And what was going on?
I was engaged in community is the short answer. I had support. And it came in the form of the people I work with on this record. My wife, which is why the record's dedicated to her. And Blake creating the creative space. And then specifically on that song, Brandi Carlile. Because I went for dinner with her and Elton, and they kind of cornered me to ask what was up and what was going on in my life, because I presented differently to how I had to them in the past. And I played them Cannibal and Grace and Only Child. And Brandi put her arm around me and said, dude, whatever it takes to help support you get this music out, I am going to do. And so I said, well, can you come to the studio tomorrow morning? I've got this song I'm wrestling with. I think it's the last song on the record. It mirrors in some way the first song on the record, and would you be down? And so it was a Saturday morning. She came in and helped me write. I was actually looking through my lyric book and saw I could sort of follow the way in which we wrote the song and got there in the end. Her handwriting's in it, which is cool. And it was with her. And on this record, honestly, like at various points, I hit a cul-de-sac or a T-junction or really a wall. And remarkably to me, in the way I've worked in the last decade or so, it was a woman who came along and lifted me over that wall. And on that occasion, it was Brandi, but on plenty of others, it was other people, not just sort of artists like Phoebe and Clara and Danielle Ponder, Monica, but also people behind the scenes that I now work with. And she embodied on that day the support that I think was completely fundamental and necessary for my process, not just of healing, but also of creating this record. And so really the place I was in when we wrote that song was one of feeling supported, and that helped me feel more free to be more curious about the idea of forgiveness. And it's not just forgiveness of someone who's done you wrong, but also of self I think having the capacity to forgive yourself for some of the bad choices you've made, or some of the fucked up shit you've done, is really crucial to healing.
I keep searching for this answer that never comes because the question is fundamentally bad. But I've tried a few times. You know, like, how did you feel when you finished this record? How did you feel?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was like an 18-month process. Most of it was based here. I did a lot at home to start with, and then I did a lot of it in the studio here with Blake, who was my partner in this, really. And I kind of held it together, and we tussled. You know, he's a visionary guy, so. And my problem is I'm such a fan of his work that anything he does, I think, sounds completely dope.
You have to develop your own voice in relation to him.
So I had to figure out, like, okay, what makes this my record and not his record?
Wow.
And that was really
and by that point, I guess you've given him enough space to work too, so you almost got to walk him back.
Yeah, no, well, it wasn't. It was more, it was just a conversation. It was constant conversation, and he was unbelievably gracious with me changing my mind a lot, and being an artist. And because he had to fulfill both the role of an artist but also a producer, which is a kind of really functional role. And we came to the last day of mixing, because he and Joseph mixed the record. And we came to the last day, and I'm leaning over the console at Sound City, facing them. He's on the computer. I'm leaning over like this. And weirdly, the last song we're mixing is Cannibal. And we're coming into land, like I know we're in the last minute of mixing this song, and it's the last song to mix, and it just all starts coming out, and I turn into a blubbering mess. I'm like weeping and worried about short-circuiting this beautiful desk they've got. And he comes round from where he stood and walks up behind me and leans his forehead on my back and puts his hands on my shoulders and just waits until I'm done, which is dope. He didn't try and like clear it up, and he wasn't uncomfortable.
Perfect.
You know, he didn't hand over.
Perfect reaction.
And that felt symbolic to me of the process that I've been through to make this record. And it was people saying, look, we're not going to do it for you, but we are going to support you. And that is so precious and so valuable to me that it's made me, and that's what makes people in general, I think, feel more free. Like, I'm going to be here with you. I'm not gonna do it for you, but I'll be with you along the way. And that's community, that's fellowship and friendship to me.